Hey guys, what's up? Yeah, I know it's been a really long time. Um, bushy beard and all that. It's This has been a really rough month, and to be perfectly honest, I would not be surprised if this or the next couple will be my very last videos. But whatever, we'll see what happens. But that's not why you guys are here. You're not here to hear my woes. You're here for me to actually come up with something worth talking about. So let's get into something that's worth talking about. Um, which is basically kind of like the evolution of different arts and how they've evolved and the way people practice them. One criticism that I have noticed that certain people who study Asian traditions, particularly the Japanese ones, one of them that they tend to levy at people who practice the HEMA type stuff, the Western martial arts stuff. They like stating that the HEMA guys are pretty much what they're doing is not at the same level as what the Asian guys are doing because the Western guys' arts are dead in the sense that you know no one was really practicing these arts for a long time. Like you know when it comes to, like, for instance, using the longsword or the messer or the zwander or many other different European cold weapons. And and even then you got, like, okay, you got certain weapon and you got other traditions like the Italian, the German, the English. They all had their own ways of using these weapons and their own preferred weapons. These particular traditions have not been practiced for a long time for practical reasons. I mean, it's like, as warfare evolved, there was no longer really a need as time went on to learn how to use things like swords and spears and halberds. It's because of the advent of the gun. The gun, supplanted the use of other melee weapons and even things such as bow and arrows. By World War I, World War II. Well, I know in World War I think there was still a couple of people running around with sabers, but for the most part, the gun pretty much changed warfare. And so there was not really a practical need to continue practicing with these sorts of weapons. And many of those weapons were out of use anyway, even during that time period. Like, yes, during the Civil War, for instance, in America, there were people using, cavalry sabers, but they weren't using long swords or small swords or anything like that. They were using guns, and then every now and then they'd mold out the sabers, but that, is a personal self-defense weapon. So they're like saying that, okay, yeah, so you guys' arts were dead, and then now you're trying to reconstruct them. So since you're reconstructing them, whatever you're going to come up with isn't going to be the same as what was used in the past, and it's not at the same level as what we in the Japanese tradition use. And mostly, the guys who practice Japanese martial arts tend to like saying this a lot. And what they say is, our arts are unbroken. I mean, it was passed down from generation to generation, from master to student and master to student, unaltered, not unchanging. So the way they done it back in the battlefield is the same way we're practicing it now, and our techniques are still alive, and we still got, and that's bullshit. Sorry, but it is. It's bullshit. Now, I know some people are going to want to instantly put angry comments down there because I'm saying something like that, but I suggest you hear me out first, listen to the video first, and then try to come up with a counter argument. It is true, at least on the surface, that with Western arts, there was a time when they weren't practicing these things anymore, again, for practical reasons. There was a time when people were no longer like, I'm going to learn how to use a longsword. That wasn't happening. And then it's nowadays people, because of their interest in this sort of thing, they're looking up old manuscripts and old written notes and things like that, old treatises, and trying to reconstruct things with their understanding of how weapons were used and coming up with something. It is true. And it is true that with, say, Japanese and Chinese arts and other Asian arts, you tend to see a long line for hundreds of years of people practicing arts, supposedly dating back centuries. Here's the problem. To suggest that they were unadulterated is fooling yourself. Either you have not done the research, or you were given misinformation, you just don't know. What you're practicing seems to be ancient, but a lot of what people are practicing these days are modern reinterpretations, Or even if one can trace whatever forms and practices that they're doing back hundreds of years, the fact that you yourself are not on the battlefield using these techniques in that way, and you're not drilling yourself, to be on the battlefield, automatically changes the flavor of how you're practicing it. If you're not even putting in the same amount of hours or the same type of effort that people in the past were doing, it's not the same. You can't say it's the same, no matter how much you want to pretend that it is. There is a history of reconstruction in Asian martial arts. Let's take Chinese, which is what I know more about. I've done a bit more research into that. There are several arts that people claim are ancient ones that are actually reconstructed. I mean, they still go back quite a ways, and they're based on old techniques, but by and large, they were reinterpreted by people who wanted to bring those arts back when they saw that they were dying. Piguozhang is a good example. Piguozhang, or loosely translated, it means like axe hitch boxing. It's a long fist method in China known for large sweeping arm motions, like almost chopping motions with the arms. And you tend to slam them down into the person. They're really good for throwing individuals, or just doing really powerful forearm blows into them. And supposedly it was also it supposedly evolved from a battlefield art when people were using armor and had to use all that momentum to hit them. There was a time when that art was dying out, if not it had completely died out, and then people kind of brought it back with techniques that they knew at the time, with certain long fist techniques that they already knew that were kind of similar to what they heard Pigo was like. They reconstructed it. They reinterpreted it. So it's not exactly the same as the way it was before, but people are still practicing it, and they're still able to use it practically, some people anyway. Xingyi is another good example of an art that's been reinterpreted. You go back, the further back you try to go to find the origins of this particular art, the more gaps you start seeing in who had supposedly learned it or mastered it and passed it down to whom. Like you have several gaps of several, years, many, 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 many years before you start seeing another practitioner. And they even admit that, this guy just reinterpreted the art based on his own understanding of spear techniques, and, transferred it to hand techniques and came up with his own version. It still works. The one thing, by the way, I want to focus on is the fact that even though these things were reconstructed, it still worked because of that person's understanding of how combat works. There are some Chinese martial arts that are, you can trace them back pretty far, but there's always some retouching or absorbing of some other art into it, or some type of change going on to it, or they'll split off into other categories. There's always something altering it. The only one I can really think of off the top of my head that can probably claim that it's unadulterated is Cha Chuan, or Cha Family Fist. That's another school of long fist, and I really would like to do a video on that one. It's unique in that it was developed by the Hui people of China, or the Muslims. There are Chinese Muslims. Just a really quick note on them. The Chinese Muslims have had a long history in China. And depending on what dynasty they were in, either they were celebrated for loyalty or they were harshly discriminated against, depending on who happened to have been in charge. But because of the sort of isolation that the Hui people have experienced over the many centuries in China, their particular martial art, the jiaomen, or religious arts, were more or less kept to themselves. There were certain things that absorbed into other arts, like for instance, the famous style Tan Tui, the original 10 roads Tan Tui, and later on they turned into 12 road, and then some even 14 roads. That comes from Cha Fist. And in fact, I'm kind of going off topic, but they contributed to a lot of different martial arts in China, from Ba Ji Chuan to even Ba Guozhang. They've contributed to a lot. But their particular art is Cha Fist. And that one has more or less remained the same over the centuries, to the point that when the Chinese Communist government wanted to come up with their modern wushu program, and they were looking for an art that they felt was the purest kung fu they could find to base their wushu program on, they ended up picking Cha Fist. Think about that for a second. I mean, of all the hundreds, if not thousands of different kung fu styles, and they ended up picking one that the Muslims made. food for thought. And it's only because they had been isolated. And then they turned it into contemporary wushu, which has nothing to do with fighting, but and that's a topic for another time. But yeah, when you consider the fact that you got all this reconstruction going on, and there are very few arts in China that can honestly claim to be unbroken. And then you also keep in mind that at the end of the Qing dynasty and during, the Republican era of China and during the whole Boxer Rebellion craziness that was going on, martial arts was in a major decline in China. People were disrespecting martial artists and finding no use for martial arts, period, to the point where groups of people such as the Jingwu school had to find ways to get the people to respect martial arts again. That means that was a period of time when several arts were close to being killed off. And they reconstructed a lot of these arts in order to get people to want to start learning them again. Modernizing the way they taught people, like the way people train now, where there's some basis for focus on basics before they instantly start throwing you to learn Chinese forms before you even know how to fight. That's a modern reinterpretation of how these arts are practiced. It's not practiced the same way. And the hardcore training, the body conditioning, the lot of pain that you had to go through to learn this stuff started to get bled off. And even the concepts of internal arts also came about during this time. Before, there was no such freaking thing. Then it became something that a bunch of scholars came up with to try to separate themselves from other people, which itself is nonsense. There's all this reinterpretation and reconstruction going on with these arts. And with reinterpretation and reconstruction comes a new way of doing it. So you're not doing it the same way that you were doing it before. So you can't go around and say, this is a living tradition, unbroken. It's been messed with. Usually for the best, sometimes for the best, sometimes for the worst, depending on your point of view. The Japanese martial arts went through something similar. Anyone believing that whatever kenjutsu they're learning is exactly the same as the way the samurai were doing it is fooling themselves. They seem to not want to study the Meiji era of China and afterwards, when many of these schools not only died off, but the ones that were still around, they basically gathered up all these schools and found out the universal principles of all of them and reinterpreted it into a modern program. This was done partially to keep Japanese martial arts alive and also partially to try to get the spirit of Budo into the people, because as they were modernizing, they were also starting to militarize. And they wanted everyone in Japan to have that warrior spirit so they can have the backing of the people to then go around and conquer other places. Everyone has that samurai spirit. And reconstructing these martial arts and trying to get everyone to learn at least a form of it was part of that program. The Do's started supplanting the Itsus, if you know what the hell I'm talking about. Before, it used to be called Kenjutsu, Jujitsu, and so on and so forth. These were actual combative arts. And they're still practiced today, more or less. Just not the same way it was done in the past. But now you got Kendo, Karate Do, Judo, the way, where it's more about perfecting the technique and perfecting yourself than straight up, dismantling somebody. Not to say that these arts aren't useful. They are. There's a lot of, experts in, say, Kyokushin karate who will just dismantle people. But by and large, it was a change in how they've done it. It became a bit more sport-oriented, more perfecting the way you move rather than just throwing you like, okay, you know how to fight. Now let's actually, do a whole lot of sparring, throw you out in the battlefield, learn how to use weapons to defend yourself in a life or death situation. That started getting bled off. Where even in Japan nowadays, you'll go to certain schools and train over there. Yeah, they train hard, very diligent. But it's not exactly that same mindset of, I need to use this to keep from somebody coming down the hills and killing me. And that in itself changes it. Plus the whole modernization that was going on with all these arts during the Meiji era and afterwards also changes the flavor of the art. And that's what people need to understand. When you start modernizing things and when you start, reinterpreting things, you are right there changing the flavor of whatever it is that you're getting it from. Especially since, like I said, when, let's say, most of the guys who are knocking the HEMA people are katana users. There were so many schools back then that are just gone now. And many of the schools that were left, their techniques, many of the people who were reconstructing, sorry, I'm sick. Many of the people who were reconstructing these arts, they just basically looked for universal principles among all these different schools, and they were like, this is what we're teaching. This basic understanding of how to use the sword, these basic principles are what's going to make you real. They kind of distilled a lot of this stuff, which is not a bad thing. And they did come up with something useful. It's not like somebody who's learning these modern reinterpretations won't know how to use these weapons. They will. But it's not done the same way as it was in the past. And if you're saying that, you're fooling yourself. I mean, are you learning, for instance, how to deal with a guy coming at you on horseback while you're on the ground with just your katana? If you're not learning that, stop fooling yourself into thinking that you're learning some ancient samurai art that's been passed down from generation to generation exactly the same way. You're not. Are you learning how to attack from horseback with a nodaichi? If not, you need to come back down to earth. You really do. And again, this is not to say that these reinterpretations are useless. You can still use your weapon competently with these new reinterpretations. No one's saying that. Again, that's what I said about the Chinese stuff. There's a lot of reconstructing and reinterpreting of a lot of arts, including the so-called Shaolin ones. In fact, many times these days, you find certain monks who are artificially trying to make their art look older. Like they're making themselves look stiffer to make themselves look like the wood blocks and statue paintings of certain techniques. There's a lot of stuff going on, a reinterpretation of what was done before that wasn't done the same way. The Japanese arts are no different. And to make matters worse, they're having a problem finding students. I mean, I know in the Western world, people are, fascinated by Asian martial arts. But in Japan or in China itself, they're having a hard time finding students who are willing to go through the amount of effort and the time and the pain. Let's not forget the pain that goes into learning these things. I mean, sure, you'll, in like some, town somewhere, like away from the major cities, where there's some ryu somewhere training people in Japanese techniques, you'll probably find some dedicated people who are willing to keep those techniques alive. But even they aren't necessarily learning at the same level of a samurai. Like they're not, okay, now you know this technique, now we're going to put armor on you and put you on a horse and go up against this other guy using a yari against you. That's not going on. And you're fooling yourself if you're thinking that the level that they're doing it at. And they're having a harder and harder time finding students willing to even learn it at the way they're teaching it to them. Like in this modern day and age, you're not going to find many people willing to put in 6 hours a day, 8 hours a day training in a martial art. Whether it's a Japanese one, a Chinese one, in Taiwan, Thailand, Vietnam, no matter where the hell, you're going to, much less in the Western world. Even in the Asian world, where they know like, in China, the whole thing about eating bitter or going through hell to master a technique, even there, I don't got time for that. They're modernizing. And younger people, like, even over there, it's like, why am I going to go through that when I can get a gun? Or I can, just get a stick and beat the crap out of them that way or something. And over here, especially, people aren't necessarily learning martial arts in order to defend themselves. They're doing it more because they just have a passion for the art. Like they're pretty much doing it at a hobbyist level. And that's something that insults a lot of martial arts, to be told that it's a hobby. This isn't a hobby, it's a way of life. Okay, are you practicing it for like around 6 hours a day every day? Be honest with yourself. If you're not, you're a hobbyist. If you're doing it for like 3 days a week for 3 hours a day, it's a hobby. You may be good at it. You may be able to competently defend yourself, but you are not at the same level as somebody who had to learn how to do this professionally. Don't kid yourself. And what you are learning is most likely a reinterpretation of what was done in the past. You can't help it. These arts had to evolve over the years. They had to change somewhat with the times, and especially with the way people were teaching it. Remember, a lot of people were later, as generations went on and martial arts became less and less needed to defend yourself, teachers had to find new ways of passing this down to people in a format that they would accept. And telling somebody, for instance, to stay in horse stance for like 10 minutes straight is not something that the average modern person is willing to put up with. They want to get to the good stuff right away. Ip Man, for instance, had to alter the way he taught Wing Chun to his students. And that's a modern teacher. Everyone's talking about like Ip Man is like, he knew the pure Wing Chun. And he had to alter it when he went to Hong Kong. He, right away, that's something a lot of people don't know. Part of the reason why the Wing Chun students were so good at the time in fighting in the street fights is because he went directly into teaching them Chi Sao. You know, like the whole bridge hand thing where they like test each other's sensitivity, the hands are touching and they can feel when the person's about to attack them. That's a very practical skill to learn, and he taught them that early. So right away, they were instantly grasping how to effectively use their techniques. That wasn't normally done. In the beginning, it was a lot more basics drilling. So right there, we're seeing a reinterpretation of the art. It changed up. It wasn't done the same way as it was in the past. You find examples of this throughout martial arts the more you research them, especially with like when you see major programs such as the martial arts programs that had popped up during the Republican era in China, or the programs that popped up, you know, in Japan when they were modernizing and becoming more militarized. You see examples of this like crazy. You're not practicing it the same way. So to then jump on the HEMA guys and say that, oh, what you guys are doing is inferior is nonsense, because they're doing pretty much what the Asian guys are doing, just a little bit later in time. But the whole thing of looking at techniques and trying to reinterpret how they were done and using them in a practical way and getting an understanding, trying to understand as much as they possibly can of these older techniques, these older European techniques, it's the same thing that was done in Asia. Same thing. And one thing I will say also is, I'm sorry, but so many times when I've seen, like, say, you know, somebody who's claiming to be an expert in Kenjutsu and he's going up against somebody who spent a few months doing HEMA stuff, I usually see the HEMA guy winning. Because they're all about trying to use their techniques in a practical way. The whole thing about trying to reach enlightenment or perfecting the perfect way to draw their sword is not like, how do I use this to kill the other guy? That's the focus. Yeah, maybe what they're doing is not exactly the same way as it was done in the past. But you know what? These guys can still use these weapons. They're using it their way, and it's based on old techniques, and they're making it work. And that needs to be respected. Especially since this is nothing new in all martial arts. The way people use katanas these days is not exactly the same way that was done in the past. I'm not saying they don't work. They do. But it's a new interpretation. It works. I'm not knocking it. But it is what it is. Chinese art's the same way. Especially Chinese weapon arts have been distilled so much to, like, before weapons were just weapons. You use them. And nowadays weapons are tools in Chinese martial arts to teach you a certain aspect of Kung Fu. Like the straight sword, for instance, is there to teach you how to use angles to take out your opponent. They distilled Chinese swordplay so much that now it's about finding, like, you use this weapon to teach you how to find open angles. You know, step out the way of an attack and come in. That's what the weapon's supposed to teach you. Like, they, you know, again, that is a modern reinterpretation of how it's done. This happens all the time. So what the HEMA guys are doing are no different. You know, trying to rediscover techniques or reinterpret techniques and try to, like, figure out how it was done back then. In fact, I gotta end this. This has gone on too long, but I also wanted to stress that I'm saying the word reinterpret a lot. This is not to say that, you know, HEMA guys or even the Asian martial arts guys are trying to find, this old technique was done in a stupid way. I'm going to do it this way. That's not, when I'm saying reinterpreting, that's not really, because that's what it's, when I'm saying reinterpreting, that's probably what people are thinking. No, it's just more like, okay, here's a technique that they're trying to figure out how it's done. Sometimes they're able to get it right off the bat. Like, they know, oh, that's how it was done, and they're able to do it. But then there are other times they look at the technique and are like, I'm not sure. Maybe it's done this way, or maybe it's done this way. That's when the reinterpretation comes in. And then they find a way to make it work. Sometimes they can, sometimes they can't. But this is what happens throughout the years, because things are forgotten. Things change. Things are altered. Things are pushed aside for reasons that have to do with, you know, the context of the time that they're living in. All martial arts have gone through this. Asian arts are no different. And what's going on with the Western stuff right now, in fact, what's going on with the Western stuff should be of interest to Asian martial artists who want to get an idea of what their art probably went through when they were trying to be brought back from the grave. Because it's happened. You're having a really good opportunity of seeing how people could have possibly brought certain skills back. Instead of knocking these guys, you should probably be paying more attention to them, like seeing how they're going about what they're doing, because there's some interesting stuff going on. Anyway, that's it. Catch you guys later.